In this video we're going to be looking at what makes up a valid RMA. Obviously if you request an RMA and your processor is still good and you receive a new processor that is equally good, then when you put it back into your system, any of the problems that exhibited before you when you claimed your initial RMA will still exist. So what we want to do here is to look at some of the main things that you need to look at before claiming an RMA. So let's start with the motherboard. The first thing you're going to look at is the BIOS up to date in the motherboard you're using? So Tim, can you talk me through a little bit of the sorts of things would exhibit itself if you had your BIOS wasn't up to date?
So if your BIOS is out of date, some of the issues that can happen would be that your processor isn't identified correctly. So it may be identified as an AMD processor as opposed to an AMD Athlon or AMD Phenom. And as your processor isn't being identified correctly, it can be running slightly out of specification. So it may be running slightly hotter, it may be running not at the correct speed, and then this can cause other problems within your operating system and the smooth running of your system.
Okay, thanks. So in our video series of when to claim an RMA and not, and some of the diagnosis steps, we're going to have a future video that looks at how you would check whether the BIOS was up to date, and if it wasn't up to date, how you would put the latest BIOS in the system. So you can look forward to that one in this series. But moving on, the next thing to look at, and is often a very frequently seen problem that we see here in AMD, is the power supply being out of spec. And systems, if the power supply is not in spec, systems can really operate fairly randomly. So Tim, could you explain to me some of the things that you would be looking for in the power supply and some of the problems that an incorrect power supply specification can provide?
So there's two main areas here. So if you're building a new system, you need to make sure that your power supply has enough power and is adequate to power your complete system, including your hard drive, your graphic cards and your CPU. So always make sure that it's a certified good quality power supply. There is a list of certified power supplies on the AMD website. And if you're upgrading a current system, you need to make sure that if you're putting in a high power CPU, say you're upgrading from an AMD Athlon to an AMD Phenom, you need to make sure that your current power supply has enough power and is adequate to cover the new power requirements of the higher end CPU.
And I guess, Tim, that would also be true for graphics cards as well, wouldn't it?
Very much so for graphic cards as well. Some of the new graphic cards of our very high-end products require a lot of power, and some of the older power supplies that might be in systems may not have the correct PCI Express power adapters that are needed to power the new graphic cards. So always make sure that your power supply has the right connectors, is certified and has enough power to cover everything in your system.
Okay, thanks. That's great. So now we've guaranteed, or we've looked at the BIOS being up to date and fully functional, and that's our first check mark, right? And then we've gone through and checked that our power supply is specified correctly to do the job that it's doing. And again, there's a video in this series that will explain to you how to go and check your power supply in more detail. But finally, your system is still randomly crashing, and you've been through the first two steps, and now what are the other things that you would want to do in the next stage of the troubleshooting, Tim?
So the next stage would be swapping components out of your system. So if you're doing a CPU upgrade of your current system and you have your old processor available, maybe you could swap that back into the system to see whether or not the same issues and problems occur. If they do, then it could well indicate that your processor would need to be RMA'd. However, if it isn't happening, then there could be another issue with your system, so you could start swapping out other components if you have them available. You could start swapping out different pieces of memory, or if you have multiple pieces of memory, just try running the system with one piece of memory and then maybe try swapping it into the different slots on the motherboard to see whether it's a problem with the memory or with the slots on the board. Another thing to try would be, if you have a spare graphic card, to try a spare graphic card, or to move your existing graphic card into a different slot on your motherboard. Once you've tried all of these, then the problem could well be related to your processor.
Okay, thanks, Tim. So what you just said to me was that we would go through and check out the memory, and we would swap the memory around in the various slots.
That's right.
That would be the first thing we'd do. Then we'd probably want to look at the graphics card and swap that out and change it within the different slots within the motherboard. That would certainly be something worth testing.
Yes, especially if you have a spare graphic card to try as well.
Yeah, that's a good advice, Tim. Thanks. Okay, so we've tried swapping everything out. Obviously, not everyone's going to be able to do that, and there are places, if you can seek some professional help, that they may be able to perform these swap outs for you. So that's strongly advised. Anyway, if you've gone through all of the processes that we've outlined in this video, and again, we will be showing you a video in more detail as to how you can swap things out and what to look for, so look forward to that one. But if you followed the 3 steps we've recommended, i.e. is your motherboard BIOS up correct? Yes, we've checked out and we've put a big tick box there. Is the power supply functioning correctly and is it certified? Yes, we can answer that and put a big tick on that. And we've done the component swap outs. Now, if we're in this state and your processor is, your system is still randomly freezing, it could well be that the processor is at fault. So in this case, AMD would welcome you raising an RMA with us, and we will do a replacement for you.